Hi. There are two concepts here, war and peace, and we're going to start on a positive note in talking about the Ukraine war, and we'll start with peace, okay? I'm a psych professor, and not psychiatry, but we'll be talking about psychiatry at the end of this video. Now, I taught for a few decades in a graduate division training people to be therapists, especially marital therapy, couples counseling. And there are two concepts here that are extremely relevant to the Ukraine war. So it's a very interesting metaphor. When people come for marriage counseling, okay, they're usually in a dark state and they're projecting and they're blaming, and she's wrong and he's wrong and you're wrong. And that's kind of the presenting issue when we first start. All right. So, uh, the first lesson in marriage counseling, which really applies to politics, is you got to listen to the other side. She cheated on me. There's nothing to say. Oh, yes, there might be. You might want to learn something. What went on with her? He cheated on me. We're done. We're finished. Okay. But hearing the other side is very, very difficult. One of the first courses in marriage therapy, in counseling, is to teach the person to listen objectively, openly to the other side. A lot of people can't do that. If you're talking to a murderer or a drug addict or a person who sells drugs or a person who abused their child, it's very hard to listen to what their perceptions of the world or their feelings. Some people don't make it through that first course. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at what it's like to hear the other side and to be empathic to the other side. Very difficult. All right, so we start now. Let's with Ukraine. What is Ukraine saying? All right, now this is easy for us, but it's very difficult for a Russian to process. Okay, so we, Ukraine, we are a sovereign country. We can make military alliances with whomever we please. We are not Russia's vassal state. You got it? Russia invaded our country for no reason. Russia was the aggressor, no question about it. Putin is a ruthless killer, a terrorist, a warmonger, a war criminal. He should be arrested. Our territory on your left, that was Ukraine. And Russia has taken all the red parts. And we want it all back. No compromise. Okay? That's our position. Gulp. So now let's listen to the Russian side. Okay? Now, this is difficult for Westerners, but our job here is to try to understand both sides openly and clearly. The U.S. overthrew the government of the Ukraine in a coup in 2014 and chose its first president. Oh, is that true? Well, that's how Russia sees the world. We're talking about how Russia sees the world. Since 2015, Ukraine was bombing the people of Donbass and Russian-speaking eastern Ukraine. The U.S. and NATO have been building up their influence in Ukraine ever since. Russia will not allow NATO and the U.S. to build military bases on its 1,200-mile border with Ukraine. You got it? That is an existential threat. A missile on Russia's Ukraine border can hit the Kremlin in 7 minutes. That's unacceptable. Remove all NATO presence from our borders or the war will never end. Napoleon attacked us from the west. Hitler attacked us from the west, and NATO will be not attacking us from the west. The U.S. went to war with the USSR trying to put missiles in Cuba in 1962. And we went to war in Ukraine for the same reason. We will not permit you to build missile bases 300 miles from the Kremlin, period. That's the closest part from the Ukraine to the Kremlin. It's 308 miles, my friend, and we are not going to allow that to exist. You don't seem to understand that. That is a strategic, existential threat. That's why we went to war. Okay? Gulp. And that's certainly two huge differences in perception, right? And listen, over 1 million people have died since 2022 over that conflict. So we're going to talk peace. So what's the next step in marriage counseling? Well, now that you have listened to each other and heard each other's side, why he cheated, why she cheated, do you want a divorce or do you want to save this marriage? Now, you're not going to believe this, but 70% of marriage counseling is successful. Check your facts. 30% say, okay, I'm out, I'm done, I've had my session, I'm finished with this relationship. 70% decide they're going to work on it, and they're successful at it. So what is the first step? Well, for Russia and Ukraine, the question is then, do you want peace or do you want more war? 1 million people have died. Do you want to continue this or do you want to make some kind of rapprochement? If you want peace or you want to save this marriage, then you need to have a moratorium on blaming. Step number 2. Stop the hostility. Stop the banging on the tables. Stop the driving your car wildly. Stop acting out. Let's calm down and let's see if we can make some kind of peaceful arrangement, a compromise. Okay, are you prepared to work? If you are prepared to work, we need to stop the hostility, a moratorium on hostility. All right? And that means we need a ceasefire. Now, Russia is opposed to a ceasefire right now. We're making this video in November of 2025. They don't want a ceasefire because they think Ukraine will use that to rearm. So Russia really has to make the first step. If we use the marriage counseling metaphor, Russia has to make the first step. First, there has to be a ceasefire, then the negotiations. Russia wants to have the negotiations, then a ceasefire. So Russia has to make the first step. Okay? So let's get ready for a compromise. Compromise? Why should I compromise? She cheated on me. Why should I No, stop that. You understood why she cheated on you. You understand why he cheated on you. Now let's see. And you want to save the marriage. So let's see if we can find compromise. All right. What are you willing to offer to meet the other person's needs? Well, what's Russia going to offer Ukraine? Well, let's see. Okay. We're currently surrounding a few cities, and if in the future we'll be surrounding more, because Russia's winning, and they could say, well, those 3 cities that we've surrounded, we're going to leave them, we're going to surrender them as a goodwill gesture to Ukraine. Well, that'll make Ukraine feel better, certainly not going to end their problems, but if they retreat from 3 cities, that's a nice gesture. Thank you very much. It's not enough. No objections if Ukraine wishes to join the EU as long as there's no NATO. Really? Yeah. If you want to have a democracy and you want to elect your president and you want to join the European Union, we have no objections. We just don't want NATO. Do you understand that? It's an existential threat. But if you want to join the EU, go right ahead. Well, Ukraine didn't realize that that's true, and that would also appeal to Ukraine. Ukraine's army can become as large as it wants. as long as there's no NATO. Now, that's another thing that would, because there's a lot of rumors that Russia doesn't want Ukraine to have much of an army. Russia can say you can have as big of an army as you wish, as long as there's no NATO. That's appealing. Anything else? Sure, we're willing to offer $10 billion if the U.S. and the EU put in the same amount to help reconstruction. Ukraine would say, well, that's hardly enough. But at least it's better than nothing. So that's also a positive step. And here comes the offer that now all of the stuff that I'm just giving you has been negotiated, but this is new. This is a creative idea. After 5 years of peace, sanctions are lifted, travel begins, things are exactly the same on the ground. Russia offers to have a UN-supervised election in those conquered territories, Donbass, Luhansk, Crimea. And if the people vote to go back to Ukraine, that's fine. They will allow that. If the people vote to stay with Russia, they'll stay with Russia. Now, only the people, not all of Ukraine votes, not all of Russia votes, just the people in those regions vote. What kind of offer is that? Does that mean that Russia will return all of its occupied territories? Well, if it's a UN-supervised election, fine. Now, there's a but to that. And we have to be thinking about the but a few times, because remember, 75% of the people in those regions have Russian as their native language, not Ukrainian. 90% of the people in Crimea speak Russian at home. They are likely, if they're voting, they're likely to vote to stay with Russia. Now, there's one poll from the Ukraine says, no, they want to come back. And there's one poll from Russia that says, no, they want to stay. So we really don't know what a vote would result in. Now, there would be resistance in Ukraine and resistance from Russia for doing that. But it's a very rational, peaceful solution to this problem. Okay? 90% of the people in Russia polls say they want to stay in with Russia. Can that data be believed? A lot of people don't believe Russian polls. So, in other words, Ukraine may not get what it wants if it agrees to this proposal. But, by the way, this proposal I'm giving you is very close to Trump's latest proposal, except for this voting process that I just mentioned. All right. So, is Ukraine prepared to risk that? Is Russia prepared to risk that? Losing all those territories on the basis of a UN-supervised election? Well, that's certainly a big compromise and towards peace. Well, what is Ukraine going to offer? We don't have to offer anything. We're the victims here. No. This is marriage counseling. It takes two to have a marriage, two to have a divorce. What are you willing to give to the other party? You wanted peace. You have to play the game here. What are you willing to offer? Well, Ukrainians who left the country, 7 million of them, they can return and we will not punish them for leaving. That'll please Russia, because Russia believes most of those people left because they do not support that war. That's a gesture, thank you. And we will have no NATO bases, no personnel, no foreign troops on our soil, no Patriot missiles, no HARMs, no ATACMS, no Storm Shadow missiles, no German, no French, no British armaments, no NATO. Wow, that's everything Russia wants. That's very interesting. And we'll have new elections. The Russians lost 27 million people to the Nazis. They are very upset about Ukrainian Nazis. They want denazification. Anyway, the offer here is that there would be new elections, a new government, but there would be no Nazis, nor Nazi parties or Nazi-like parties allowed. They're called Banderites, okay? And there are such people in Ukraine. At one time, there was a party called Svoboda that had 30% of the legislature, very right wing, very band right, which is, I don't want to go into that, but there are some Nazis there. And if they promised no Nazis, that would be very appealing to Russia. And the sanctions will be lifted. That will be very appealing to Russia. All of that would be nice. But there's a but on that for the Russian side, too, and that is the Nazis in the western part of Ukraine, that's where most of them are, they don't even speak Russian. They hate Russia. And they might get rid of their swastikas, but they will still appear in other kinds of political parties. So when the Russians want denazification, they're not going to really get it. Okay, they'll just appear in different names. And they still might elect a very anti-Russian government. Okay, so the question is, Russia, are you prepared for that? So Russia would have to say, well, we're prepared for that. All right, so if you're still willing to compromise to save this marriage, all right, are you still willing to compromise to make peace? All right, so let's take our chances and make a deal. We've come so close so many times, and it always seems to fall apart. So now we're going to make a deal. Now remember, 72% of Ukrainians want a negotiated peace in polls. 66% of Russians want a negotiated peace. So we are really acting in the interests of both populations in doing this. Now, the good sides of peace are in a marriage, the children are spared further trauma and further fears of abandonment. And in war, children are spared further trauma, too. The killing stops, reconstruction begins, normal life starts. Remember, 17% of Ukrainians are married to Russians. So there is a great deal of prior connectedness. Now, there are doubts when it comes to marriage counseling and doubts when it comes to a peace agreement. In marriage, he says, if she cheated once, will she do it again? And she says, if he hit me once, will he do it again? Maybe I shouldn't go. Maybe I shouldn't make this deal. Doubts about making peace in the war. The Ukrainians say, well, if there's an election and it doesn't go the way the Russians want, will the Russians actually give back those territories? Or are they just kidding? And in Russia will say, well, if the election goes our way and the provinces decide to stay with Russia, will Ukraine go back to fighting? So there are always doubts about these kind of agreements. So what happens if there's along the way in marriage, what happens if she doesn't, he's not keeping his side of the deal, she's not keeping her side of the deal? Well, then you go back to therapy and you try to work it out. But if you're dealing with war and peace, there has to be some kind of mediation mechanism. What happens if Russia accuses Ukraine of cheating, or Ukraine accuses Russia of cheating? Well, there could be a mediation body, like a court of some sort. 6 judges from Ukraine, US, and EU, 6 judges from Russia, China, and India, and they decide all these disagreements, who's cheating, who's right, who's wrong. But what if there's a tie? Well, we need a tiebreaker, so maybe we would have the Pope come in, or the Dalai Lama, or some agreed upon neutral party who would resolve the tie. And that way we'd save the agreement from destruction. Okay, it sounds a little bit impractical, but if you think about it, war is insane, and this is an attempt at rationality, right? In marriage, each partner makes an effort to achieve peace and harmony. And with this war, each side takes a risk for peace for their respective populations. Now, that's the best we can do on the peace side, all right? Now we have to talk about war, because we've had so many peace agreements, one in Istanbul that was this close before the war even started. And Zelensky was ready to sign it, and Boris Johnson flew in from the UK and stopped it. So lots of these agreements, Alaska, get close and then it falls apart. So let's talk about war now. The danger of not behaving rationally. All right. Remember, the U.S. and Russia are nuclear powers. Ukraine is not. All right. Now, Helen Caldicott, a psychiatrist, said nuclear war is consummate madness. Robert J. Lifton, psychiatrist, said in a book, Destroying the World to Save It. Okay, nuclear war is madness. Hannah Arendt, not a psychiatrist, a philosopher, said those contemplating nuclear war are certifiably insane. So peace is necessary to achieve, and we are closer to nuclear war than we have imagined. It isn't just Ukraine, which is a non-nuclear power. The United States is actively involved here. This is a video of Ukrainians attacking 1,200 kilometers inside of Russia. In the Caspian Sea, they've attacked even the Moscow suburbs. They have reached the Moscow suburbs.
How deeply involved is the United States in the Ukraine war? The New York Times just dropped a wild investigation. Turns out the U.S. isn't just sending weapons to Ukraine, but also helping plan the actual fights from a secretive base in Germany. Inside Wiesbaden, hundreds of American military brains are working daily with Ukraine's army to assist mission planning, drone targets, real-time battlefield advice. NATO is...
The United States is aiding and assisting the Ukrainian forces with satellite data, with targeting information, and out of Wiesbaden, Germany. And there have been drones that have reached the suburbs of Moscow. And they can reach at least to 1,300 miles inside of Russia. In fact, they did one operation that was further than that. So let's reverse roles for a second here, all right? Imagine, now this is for Westerners, and this is hard to do. Imagine that Cuba has drones and they're attacking the United States, okay? And Russian personnel, like there are American personnel in Wiesbaden, there are Russian personnel in Venezuela, using Russian satellites, equipment, soldiers, helping to target the suburbs of Washington, D.C. from drones flown out of Cuba. Can you imagine that? I'm sorry, I can't. It would never happen. We would never allow that to happen. I can't fathom it. Okay. Well, that's kind of how the Russians see this conflict. It is happening every day inside of Russia. U.S. is aiding and abetting Ukrainian attacks. The situation is more dangerous than we believe and more dangerous than the media reports. Follow me now, because this is where it gets a little bit tough. Now, Zelensky says, Putin is just bluffing. It's blather. He's not going to go nuclear. All right, and that's kind of what a lot of the media is saying, too. But there is a great deal of escalation going on, and it's very, very worrisome. Trump just said, I might give Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. A Tomahawk missile could hit Moscow with a nuclear weapon. They can carry nuclear weapons. And he said, I think I'm going to give it to him. I'm not going to give it to him. Yes, I am going to give it. I go back and forth. But it's a threat, okay? Now, Tomahawk missiles to hit the Kremlin, it's only a distance of 304 miles. All right? That's Moscow's worst nightmare. A Tomahawk missile. Worst nightmare. In the entire history of disarmament negotiations, that would be Moscow's worst nightmare. Now, at the same time that Trump is threatening tomahawks, Russia has announced the Burevestnik missile. It is a nuclear-powered missile that can stay in the air for hours, for days, and it can hover, and it can carry a nuclear warhead. It could park itself off the coast of the United States and hit New York and Washington whenever Russia presses the button. It exists, it's operational, but it hasn't been deployed at this moment in time. But that is America's worst nightmare, except there's another nightmare for America, and that is the Oreshnik. It's another missile. It's a hypersonic missile that travels 7,000 miles an hour. You can't stop it. Nothing can stop it. Okay. If they parked it in Venezuela, which they have threatened to do, it also can carry a nuclear weapon, which cannot be stopped. Impossible to stop the Oreshnik. It's operational, but it hasn't been deployed as of November 2025. It's a major escalation if they ever did that. If the U.S. is thinking of invading Venezuela right now, maybe it's because of the oil, maybe it's because of the government, maybe it's because of drugs, maybe it's because they don't want Russia to be able to deploy a missile like that in Venezuela. So both sides are quietly escalating. Okay? It's approaching a critical mass. Now, this is Dugin's. Dugin is Putin's closest philosophical advisor. And he said World War III is coming. He's not to be discounted. So the dangers of misperception and miscalculation are great. I'm not exaggerating. So the U.S. sees Russia as aggressive and unpredictable. The Russians see U.S. as aggressive and unpredictable. Now, this is a U.S. psychiatrist whose job it was to examine everybody involved in the nuclear program, the controllers, the missile operators, and so forth, to make sure that they're psychologically fit. Here's what he says about Trump.
Statements. Would I feel comfortable allowing Airman Trump to be around nuclear weapons? My answer to that was absolutely not without further psychological evaluation. That brings us to the great irony that the entire nuclear chain of command, from the airmen and the missile silos, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are all held to the highest degree of psychological stability and standards, except one person, the President of the United States, the very person who has his finger on the nuclear button.
So he's of the opinion that if he evaluated Trump, Trump would not qualify to be able to handle nuclear weapons. And here are two psychiatrists who have said that Putin is also psychologically incompetent to deal with nuclear weapons. He is megalomaniacal and has a lust for power and should not have his finger on the nuclear trigger. Both men are considered psychologically unfit to be in charge of their respective nuclear arsenals. The chances of an impulsive act, an irrational act, an emotional act, a mistake, a misperception are very, very high. Now, you might think, oh, Kroth, you're exaggerating. I'm not. I'm reporting. I'm not exaggerating. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists puts out the doomsday clock. It was 7 minutes before midnight during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we were that close to World War III. This is the doomsday clock now, 90 seconds before midnight. Okay? So we have a very unstable situation right now. Bertrand Russell, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, sent a telegram to Khrushchev and a telegram to Kennedy. This is what he said. Your actions are desperate, threat to human survival. No conceivable justification. Civilized man condemns it. We will not have mass murder. ultimatum means war. End this madness. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev listened to that, and I think both replied. So he is a voice of sanity and rationality, or he was. So we have these two macho males in 1962, but here in 2025 we have two gigantic macho males confronting each other. And no one decided that John Kennedy was mentally unfit to handle the nuclear arsenal. So let us hope that sanity, peace, and rationality will prevail. Thank you very much for watching.